Hey guys, welcome back to We're Talking Movies. My name's Cade, joined by my friend Andrew, and this is our review for Skyfall from 2012. Andrew, with Skyfall, would you say that it's one of the best James Bond movies ever made? Because I honestly think it's one of my favorite Bond films of all time.
I would definitely agree with that. I don't know if it would crack top five, but I'd say definitely top 10, which for a franchise that has over 20 something entries, I'd say that's pretty damn good.
Yeah, of course. And I think part of what makes it one of my favorites and one of the best Bond films ever made is when I look back at it, it is my favorite of all five Daniel Craig Bond films. The main reason why is because I just really love the story that this movie has to tell. When it comes to what the story is for the movie, I love the idea of Bond going up against a former MI6 agent. I've always thought that that was a unique concept because I've always liked the idea of the hero essentially battling his doppelganger. That's always been a fascinating concept. And I know it's probably overdone at this point, but I think it can still be compelling if it's executed properly. And, obviously this concept was explored before in GoldenEye with the character Alec Trevelyan, but I think what's different is the former MI6 agent in this movie, played by Javier Bardem as Silva, is that unlike Alec Trevelyan, he has no personal connection to Bond. Instead, it's a personal connection to M. I think that was interesting to explore because it was a different type of formula to that concept of the hero going up against his doppelganger.
Yeah, and I think the best way to put it is this is a different kind of Bond story. This isn't, oh, there's a shadowy organization or villain who's trying to take over the world or obtain immense wealth. This is a revenge story for the villain, for Silva. And it's not even against Bond. Again, it's about M and MI6 as a whole. And honestly, you got to give him credit because he kind of does inadvertently achieve his goals towards the end. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a minute. But aside from, the idea of Bond battling Silva, what I also really like about the formula of this film is aside from how spectacular the opening sequences of this movie, I've always liked the idea of, the story being ignited by a mission gone wrong, which is essentially what this movie sets up at the beginning.
Exactly. And not only is it a mission gone wrong, this is a very different interpretation of James Bond himself as a character. I think you'll agree with me on that because this one obviously some of the aspects that we all know about James Bond, the suave super spy are still there, but from a good chunk of this movie, if not the majority of it, James Bond is kind of broken down. He's broken down physically. He fails his physicals. He tries to get back into the field. He's clearly scarred emotionally, learning all of these dark secrets about both his past and M's past and MI6 as a whole. And he's past his prime mentally, and he kind of knows that. And he's trying to, keep that buried deep. But he's still got a job to do, and he's got one very dangerous enemy to face. But he's not bulletproof in this movie, and that's something that Daniel Craig's Bonds I think did very well across the entire franchise, but especially in this movie. Again, I don't think we've ever seen James Bond vulnerable, I think is kind of the best word to put it, but I know that's not the perfect way to describe it.
But yeah, and I think that because of that, when it comes to the storyline of the film, and this relates to not just this movie, but all the movies in general, I love how these movies continue to develop Bond as a character. And that's a big part of why I enjoy this era's version of Bond, because it really helps me stay invested in his character as we watch his journey play out.
Yeah, I completely agree. That the main reason why I really love the Craig Bonds is that there is this kind of continuous character development throughout the entire five movies, which is something you really don't see elsewhere in the series.
Yeah, and aside from the development of Bond, another pro that I have with this movie for sure is definitely Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig's performance definitely remains one of the standouts in his era. And although other actors have really shined in the role, I think Craig does such a great job capturing Bond's humanity. And that's a big part of what keeps us invested in his character. And it's part of what makes his character more believable.
Yeah, I don't really like using this phrase because I don't really because I think it gives some more negative connotations than positive, but it's a more human interpretation of James Bond.
Yeah, it is. And I think what's nice about that is, Daniel Craig definitely adds a lot to that. And regarding this movie, and don't get me wrong, I think Daniel's great throughout his whole era, all five films, but performance wise, I think he's especially great in this movie specifically.
I would agree with that. I think this is out of his five performances, this is probably his strongest one, followed by Casino Royale and then probably No Time to Die.
I agree. But aside from Bond and Daniel Craig, another standout for this movie that we definitely have to give credit for is definitely Javier Bardem as Silva. Javier gives such an iconic performance as Silva. I would argue that along with how well the character is written, I think that Javier's acting is definitely a big part of why Silva landed so much and why he's definitely, in my opinion, arguably one of the greatest Bond villains ever created.
Yeah, Javier Bardem is definitely one of those actors who I think was born to play a Bond villain, like say Christopher Walken or Christoph Waltz.
And aside from Javier's performance, I think that Silva's motivation, like we were saying earlier, is actually really interesting because if you think about it, he's not another villain who wants to take over the world or destroy it, which, has obviously been explored in previous Bond films. And while there's nothing wrong with that, I do think it is a little overdone at this point. And that's what made his motivation so interesting, how he's this former agent who wants to exact vengeance on M and MI6 as a whole for leaving him behind. And what I think is fascinating about that is, again, like you said earlier, it's sort of a revenge mission for him. And in a way, he's a villain that Bond can kind of relate to in that sense.
Yeah, plus, I mean, you got to give him credit for the fact that he's physically intimidating, he's hyper intelligent, he's ultra talented as a hacker, he's got immense resources at his disposal, and he knows how M ticks. And thus, I think he probably would know how Bond ticks too.
Yeah, and despite the fact that Bond kills him at the end of the movie, I really like the fact that Silva fulfills his mission. M dies, which is sad to see, but one reason why I think it works is because on some level, Silva essentially won, which is not something that we usually see in Bond films.
I mean, yeah, I mean, MI6 was basically destroyed and made to look humiliated, and M died. Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, Silva doesn't survive to see it, but he does kind of win. It's kind of like Thanos between Infinity War and Endgame.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the reasons why Skyfall as a film really stands out amongst all the other 20 plus films in the franchise as well.
Yeah, no, this is a really good one. And I actually have two more things I really liked about this movie that I need to mention.
Go ahead.
Number one is that the Craig Bonds all have really good action sequences, but I think this one actually has the best in not only the Craig Bonds, but maybe the entire series. Because think about it, you got the motorcycle chase at the beginning of the movie in Morocco. You've got the fight in the Shanghai skyscraper with the beautiful backlighting. You got the final showdown at Skyfall Ranch. You got the chase in the London Underground. They're all phenomenal action sequences. They're all fight choreographed well. They're shot well. They're intense. They're punchy. They're just phenomenal. And for a Bond movie, I think that's important. So that's one. And like I said, and this is a hill I will die on, I think this has the best action in the entire Bond franchise because it doesn't feel ultra gimmicky like some of the action in, say, the earlier movies from the 60s and 70s. The other thing I wanted to praise is Skyfall by Adele.
Yes, yep.
Another hill I will die on. It's the best Bond theme of all time, besides maybe the actual. Again, hill I will die on. It's a phenomenal song, and I actually still have it on my iPod rotation to this very day. So
Yeah, Skyfall by Adele is definitely a standout. And, back to what you were saying about the action sequences, something I have to give a lot of credit to is definitely Sam Mendes's direction. I think he definitely killed it with this movie. And aside from Sam Mendes, and I think you'll probably agree with this, is Roger Deakins' cinematography is just so incredible in this film. I'm a big fan of Roger Deakins' work, and I would argue that this is one of the best films that he's done as a director of photography. He just perfectly captures the beauty of Skyfall. And again, this relates to not only the action sequences, but also the dramatic scenes and also the overall aesthetic of the film. It just keeps audiences so engrossed. And I would say this is one of the best looking Bond films ever made.
I agree. I completely agree. Like I said, the cinematography in this movie is phenomenal. But again, especially in the action sequences, which some of these, oh geez, these could have been these probably were very hard to shoot. But again, Roger Deakins shot them phenomenally. And one last final little positive note before we move on to the few cons that we do have, which admittedly aren't many. Credit to this movie for probably being the last time we will ever see the classic James Bond Aston Martin.
Yeah, I agree. But, never know. Chances are they might bring it back for Bond 26. Time will tell.
Yeah, but I feel like we're pretty damn far away from Bond 26.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. Yeah, why don't we get into our cons? So, one con that I want to bring up about this movie is how the film handles the character of Severine. Now, this is nothing against Berenice Marlowe's performance, but I personally think that Severine as a character could have been handled a little bit better. So, if you look back at some of the previous Bond girls in the last two films, you look at characters like Vesper and Camille, and we talked about this in our reviews for those movies. They were both characters that I think worked really well because they really contributed a lot to the plots of both of those films. And they weren't just there for the sake of being there or just there to be Bond's love interest or anything. And in this movie, I think that Severine could have played a little bit more, I think she could have had a bigger role than she did in the film. And I think that Severine as a character wasn't really explored enough.
Yeah, I agree with that one. Compared to Bond girls of the past or other Bond, like you said, other Bond girls in this series, she's not the the most interesting character. She's not explored super in depth again compared to Vesper or Madeline in Spectre and No Time to Die. And yeah, that is an issue I also had with this movie because I did feel like the other movies in this franchise all gave the Bond girls quite a bit of personality and explored them pretty in depth. So
Yeah, and honestly, that's one of the reasons why, and I feel bad saying this, but that's one of the reasons why her death in the film wasn't really that upsetting because, again, I don't think that she was really explored enough for me to get as attached to her as a character.
I agree on that one.
But what's a con that you have with the movie?
Con that I have with this movie is kind of a con I have with a lot of the movies in the Craig era of Bond. This movie does feel a little long in the tooth on occasion. Like this is a 2.5 hour movie, and that's not even the longest of the Craig era. There's just bits and pieces here and there that I feel like they maybe could have cut down a little bit, but that's kind of a nitpick.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. Personally, I don't care about runtime, but I understand what you're saying. Other than that, I think my only other nitpick with the film is I kind of wish that we could have gotten a little bit more of a showdown between Bond and Silva. Now, don't get me wrong, the climax of this movie is fantastic. When Bond and his friends go up against Silva and his army, that was good. And then, we obviously get to see Bond kill Silva at the end of the film, but I kind of wish that we got just a little bit more of a showdown between the two of them. Again, it's just a nitpick and it doesn't make the movie or the climax bad or anything. I just wish that we could have seen them fight each other, if that makes any sense.
I agree, but again, these are all kind of minor nitpicks.
Yeah, they are. But on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you give this film?
In my opinion, this is a 9. In my opinion, because like I said at the very beginning, this is easily top 10, probably maybe 6 or 7 best Bond movie of all time. I did really enjoy it. I still really enjoy it to this day. I actually rewatched it very recently. Probably my second favorite in the Bonds in the Craig series behind Casino Royale, but definitely a very good movie and definitely a worthy entry in the very illustrious James Bond franchise.
Yeah, I think I'll have to agree with you. I do give it a rating of 9 out of 10 because yeah, it might not be my favorite Bond film of all time, but definitely one of my favorites. It's definitely a great film, and I think I will always regard it as one of the best Bond films ever made. So yeah, I think a 9 is a good rating. All right, guys, I think that that's the end of this review. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Threads, and we will see you later.